All right, today we're going to keep reading Sitting Pretty, and we're going to read chapter 1. It's called What's the Problem? A few months ago, at a big family gathering, my older brother David asked me about my writing. As we squeezed around the long table of food, taking up most of my parents' living room, scooping mashed potatoes and corn casserole onto our plates, he turned to me and said, "What's your writing about? What do you hope it will bring to the world?" He's a question asker, my brother. It can feel a bit like a job interview. Think on your feet quick. There's no time for deliberation. The next question's already on its way. But he also offered this invitation to be seen that I both crave and shrink from because I feel deeply connected to and also wildly different from my family. I wanted to help, I wanted to hold up the honest truth of myself for him to witness. I also tensed my muscles in preparation for being benevolently misunderstood. I'm the youngest of six kids, each of us born about 2 years after the other. That's right. With the exception of your girl here, my family produces an abundance of offspring. Right before I was born, my parents moved from their low income apartment complex, a 3 bedroom unit filled with themselves, their 5 children, and several rabbits, to a tall, early 20th century house painted a color my mom likes to call baby diarrhea yellow. Back in the day, the Tausigs existed on a plane all their own. They never locked their front door, and neighborhood kids traipsed in and out like it was an extension of their own homes. They didn't believe in wearing seatbelts or washing their hands before dinner. After all, if God wanted you to die in a car crash, no piddly seatbelt would m- make any difference, and exposure to germs made you harder. They ran around delivering homemade baskets of flowers and candy to all their neighbors on May Day, held their unwashed hands in prayer before dinner, and played outside without shoes. The cancer I was diagnosed with at 14 months old, the violent chemotherapy, radiation, and surgical treatments, and my eventual paralysis at age 3 didn't change any of this. For good or bad, growing up in the Tausig family meant no wallowing, no time for grieving, and definitely no whining. When I became paralyzed, the baby diarrhea yellow house didn't undergo any accommodations. My parents didn't install ramps or handrails, and it was several years before I got my first wheelchair. I continued to sleep on the top bunk of the top floor of the house. I learned how to pull my body up the side of my bunk bed, my feet mere props, as I used my arms to lift myself up higher and higher until I tumbled onto the top mattress. I crawled on hands and knees across the patchy grass and cracked cement sidewalks to my neighbor's house. And when she wasn't home, I sat in the mud and made little bowls and cups with the clay. I started learning how to use a catheter to empty my bladder before I learned subtraction. My 3 brothers and 2 sisters lived this with me, sleeping in the bunk bed below or beside, squeezing my hands and squinting through the nightly prayer at the dinner table, all 8 of us piling into the 1976 5 passenger Ford LTD we called Hazel, making muddy magic potions together in the backyard. We lived our days climbing over each other like puppies in a box, side by side, wrestling to the ground, elbows smushed against rib cages. It didn't occur to us to talk about my differences, unless it was to play pranks at strangers in Walmart by leaving me and my wheelchair overturned on the ground, wailing and waiting for people to rush to my aid, which they definitely did. Although in retrospect, I don't know why we thought this was so hilarious. Only much later did I realize how little we knew about ourselves, let alone each other. As close as bubbles in a glass of soda and as far away as Pluto from Earth. During this window of crawling in the mud and scrambling up to my top bunk, I believed that I was royally beautiful, valuable, and fully capable of contributing to the group. Isn't that interesting? To feel the most regal during the days of mud and clambering and scooting across the floor, I choreographed my own weird, passionate dances, wore frilly dress up gowns around town, and pretended I was married to the prince. I felt talented and dreamed big. I floated in my own bubble, a universe where everything glistened and glowed. I wore a crown sparkling with jewels. I believed everything I did, the way I moved my body, the way I looked, the roundabout paths I took was right. I'd figured out how to do all the things I wanted, and I didn't see my methods as strange or sad. I knew that kids I didn't know stared at me, that adults directed giant sympathetic smiles towards me, that I prompted tears and applause, but I hadn't yet pieced together that I didn't fit. The fact that I couldn't walk like the kids in my class, that I wore a clutchy mess of plastic, metal, and Velcro braces on my legs, using a battered aluminum walker, and sped around on my hot pink wheelchair, still didn't seem worth factoring in my evaluation of myself. At least not at first. It didn't take long at all before I began to believe different things about myself. After only a few years out in the world, going to school, playing at the park, and the pool, tagging along with my dad on his Saturday morning grocery runs, a narrative started to take shape before me, a hazy image that sharpened with time. First, I started to see myself as a burden on the people around me. Unlike all the kids, being with me required alternate routes and problem solving. I saw it everywhere. Hanging out with me meant having limited options on the playground, collaborating with collaborating with dad's muscles to get me into a friend's house, enduring very long bathroom breaks, and helping me carry my lunch tray. I calculated the people spent time with me cost them something extra. I wanted to spare them that high price. Starting around the age of 8, I cut friends out of my life as soon as I sensed my presence caused any extra strain. Soon I started to believe I was ugly. My body looked so different from the bodies we'd all been taught to admire, including my long Tausig nose. I mean, I couldn't design a time machine with all the hours I agonized over that thing. There weren't any paralyzed girls or women included in the stories told on screen, through ads, or in magazine pages. I consumed and digested the culture around me and slowly learned with certainty that I was not among those who would be needed, admired, wanted, loved, dated, or married. Not too much later, I began to see myself as weak and helpless too. With the exception of Walmart greeters, who, according to my child brain, didn't seem to do anything, I didn't see or know disabled people who were employed. I couldn't picture supporting myself with a real job or being able to pay my own bills. Most of what I saw of life felt powerful, intrinsically inaccessible to me. How was I supposed to enter those spaces, let alone contribute to them? My glistening, glowing bubble had deflated into a spot of suds evaporating on the sidewalk. This was not my universe at all. Not only did I discover I was not the princess, but I was an uninvited intruder, a problem to push out of sight. This overwhelming history towered behind me as I tried to answer David's question, with still hovering between us. What is your writing about? What do you hope it will bring to the world? My brain froze as my mouth started babbling, trying to synthesize, condense, smooth out the edges of some kind of response I could hand him. Well, I write about disability and lack of representation and the impact of inaccessibility and stigma and unemployment and. I was like a woman trying to make spaghetti in the dark, destroying the kitchen as I grabbed every ingredient in the cupboard just in case it happened to be the one I needed. In the midst of my verbal wandering, I inevitably reached for the word shame, the box where I had lived for so very long, the box I still find myself tumbling back into, with less provocation than I'd like to admit. This is the shame that attaches so easily to body that doesn't fit, the shame that buds, blossoms, and consumes when you believe that your existence is a burden, a blemish, or the well oiled machine of society. I tried to explain to David how much I wanted my writing to meet people in that shame, to lift the veil and to point the source to remind folks that their disabled bodies are not the problem here, to hold up a flag that says you are not alone. He interjected, "Shame? You felt ashamed? How? When? Why? Would you ever feel that way?" He seemed troubled and confused by this word, which caught me off guard. I had done so much work to understand my intimate relationship with shame. And my own brother, who grew up beside me, one bunk bed over, one seat behind, just across the table, didn't even know. He seemed wholly unaware that as we grew up, I had to come to see my body as a glaring problem, a weight on the world, a failed prototype. How could he not know? When I when I really think about it, I expect most people watching my life would be surprised to learn about my long-standing relationship with shame. No one ever bullied or abused me or made fun of me to my face. This was not the case of a lot of kids growing up at the same time. It's still not the case for so many kids, disabled or not, who are marginalized for any number of reasons. I know I was spared a lot, in large part because I was a cute, thin, articulate, middle class white girl. It was also a time when everyone was taught that you're supposed to be nice to the disabled kid. Only the worst bullies on the after school specials of Hallmark Channel would dare to be so vile as to make fun of the handicapped kid. The non disabled protagonist would get very outraged if this ever happened. He would give a fiery speech and rebuke the villain who'd stepped so grotesquely over the line. I never once heard a person describe me as a burden or ugly or weak or even lame. Well, maybe one, but once? Is that really enough to hijack a person's entire sense of self? In fact, people often used positive words to describe me, like joyful and bright and inspirational. By all accounts, I should have had a hearty sense of self worth. My brother David was confident that I did. So, where do we point out blame when our favorite villains, overt cruelty, and malicious intent are found to be missing in action? How do we begin to understand what happened? This one short answer is ableism. I didn't use this word when talking with David. Later, I wondered why. It's efficient and holds so much. It's the perfect word to answer the question at hand. What's the hesitation? I suppose that I felt a bit of caution whenever using this word with anyone who isn't already intimately familiar with its texture, without knowing what it feels like to live inside it. The slippery surface, the sharp cuts, and dull bruises it leaves. Ableism can feel like just another ism in a long list that people are already weary of tracking. As a high school teacher, I watch my students' eyes glaze over or drift to the window whenever the topic comes up. The word seems to shut off curiosity. It sounds familiar enough that we're confident we already pretty much understand it. It feels like a risk relying on the word ableism, but I want to use it here because I'm hoping to assemble something with you, something big and intricate. And in order to do that, we need some building blocks. Language being enough to hold stories, allow for intellectual exploration, and keep track of patterns. My definition of ableism is a little different from the one in the Oxford English Dictionary, which simply says discrimination in favor of able bodied people. Based on my decades of experience and a whole lot of reading of disability studies scholars, I find this definition insufficient. First, it's built on the assumption that there is a distinct category of able bodied people. While language that makes distinct categories can be useful, you'll sometimes see me use the term non disabled to illustrate larger patterns. Relying too heavily on this black and white definition of able bodied is dangerously misleading. It breezes much too easily over the inherent ambiguity built into having a body. Able bodied invites images of ruddy cheeked farmer boys lifting bricks up ladders. Who are these people? And really, how many of us fit sturdily into this category? The legal definition of disability, written in the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, highlights the fact that disability is a far reaching word that can attach itself to all sorts of bodies, many of them that appear perfectly able or are exceptionally able in one area but not as much in another. In fact, our ruddy cheeked farm boy might also have seizures a few times a year, or bipolar disorder, or be somewhere on the autism spectrum. The images that come to mind when we use a word like able bodied are just too one dimensional to be terribly useful. The Oxford English Dictionary definition also leaves little room for one vital piece of the story. Disability is shaped just as much, if not more, by context than by body. For example, before spectacles were invented, our population included a much greater number of people categorized as blind. Technology has changed the experience of so many bodies, and as eyeglasses have become integrated into our fashion industry, the stigma around vision that deviates from the ideal 2020 has shifted. In fact, I've owned a decent number of fake eyeglasses in my day. It's a real thing. We don't tend to equate a person wearing glasses with disability, even if that same person would have been considered disabled in another time and place. And finally, people are often shifting in and out of a disabled state by breaking a limb or getting the flu or have trouble, have horrible period cramps or become pregnant or gasp age. And suddenly they find themselves experiencing disabling limitations. If we live long enough, all of us, without exception, will become disabled. This is a prerequisite to having, living in, being a body. The idea that some of us are firmly fixed in the able bodied category is a fiction, a world built on speed, productivity, more, 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 and far too few bathrooms. And bathroom breaks does not consider or care for the actual bodies we live in. In other words, ableism affects all of us, whether we consider ourselves disabled or not, because the disabled body is more powerfully affected by ableism. It is the first to cast a light on the structure, to resist and protest it, to call for its public execution. But we were all living di- under it dictates. Ableism punishes all of us. In its most boiled down, squished together, simplified form, ableism is the process of favoring, fetishizing, and building the world around a mostly imagined, idealized body while discriminating against those bodies perceived to move, see, hear, process, operate, look, or need differently from that vision. Often the greater the deviation, the greater the discrimination. In other words, ableism is one possible answer for a young girl seeing herself as valuable as a princess one week and deflating into shame and self-loathing the next. Thanks for all you do, Oxford English Dictionary, but my definition is better. Without using the ableism word, I tried to communicate some of this to David. He was nodding along, but I could still feel the chasm between what I know in my bones and my body and what I'm able to hand him. It's like we grew up right next to the roar of the Niagara Falls, but at some point I moved to a cabin in the quiet woods, and now I'm back home, yelling over the noise, trying to explain how overwhelming it is. but David can hardly hear me or the waterfall. What words could I gather to make David feel the rumble surrounding me? Ableism thunders in the background of every conversation, every story, every building. It's the atmosphere we breathe, a body of principles, rules we live by. We learn its tenets like we learn about good and evil, with subtle and consistent reinforcement. Not only do we avoid questioning them, it doesn't even occur to us that there's anything to question. Ableism pushes assumptions like some bodies, minds, modes are inherently and always preferable to others. Hearing, speaking is always better than deafness, signing. Bipeds walking is definitively preferable to paraplegics wheeling. Each of us has a whole, unmarred, perfect body that we were meant to have. The paralyzed, autistic, deaf version is just a sadder, lesser version of that original intent. This tenet is wrapped up in narratives of fat, aging, gender nonconforming bodies, too, of course. The worth of a body is measured by its capacity for work and or the longevity of life it's able to sustain. Bodies are products, scars, breaks, and changes in function make that product less valuable. Dependence is inferior to independence. Only one body Only some bodies require help, and those bodies are a burden. It's only practical to shape the world with the majority in mind, and there is such a thing as majority. Disability is always only a deficit. The world would be a better place if we could figure out a way to eliminate it entirely, and on and on. If you find yourself nodding along with any of these ableist beliefs, that makes sense. They've been a part of our daily diet since infancy. We've made They've made us terrified of aging, wrinkles, belly fat, age spots, sagging skin, and scratch marks. They've turned us into work machines who regularly abuse our bodies to demonstrate our value. Sleep less, work harder, always. They've made us ashamed to ask for help, to take medication, to use mobility aids. They stifle our capacity to imagine other ways of being in the world. In order to be okay, we must always strive to be the ideal human: young, smooth, tight, fit, radiant, spry, boundless, unstoppable, independent. Because if we start to spill out of this tiny little mold, what will it mean? Who will we be? It takes hard work and intention to undergo these ideologies. They're loud, insistent, and reinforced at every turn. In fact, the concept of ableism is so deeply intertwined with our culture and, by extension, the wiring of my own self perception that sometimes it can be difficult for me to name. I can bend to its insistence, just as much as anyone else. Just yesterday, I whined to my coworker about my aging face. I don't even want to look in the mirror. I just covering my face with my hands and making a charming bluff sound. Yeah, I'm not the picture of post ableism enlightenment you've been looking for. Pinpointing the elements that make up an atmosphere of ableism can feel distant and abstract, like knowing the elements that make up oxygen versus knowing what it feels like to breathe in and out. How do I take you through the inhales and exhales, the way it feels when it's not just a formula in a textbook, but an experience that shapes your everyday? Ableism constricts whenever I look for affordable, accessible homes in Kansas City. Are there really only three? Or try to navigate the puzzling world of Medicaid in an attempt to keep living? I feel ableism straining my body under the rigidity of inflexible work systems that do not make space for, understand, care for, or believe bodies in pain. I, f- I feel the confines of ableism whenever I take the three steps from the driver's seat to the gas pump and forget to breathe in my concentration to make those three steps look as normal and steady as possible, even though it's much easier for me to drag my feet and swing my hips around the same distance. Ableism recommends I put myself through pain and expend extra energy to make sure that strangers walking out of 7-Eleven with a Slurpee don't stare at me, pity me, mock me for the way I move my body. I wanted David to feel this with me. How do I upload a life of memories, a dictionary of definitions, and a planet of feelings? How many times would he need to see people avert their gaze, put their children down, or fall over themselves to dive 15 feet out of my way, or frantically scramble to open a door, lest I attempt to open it myself before he'd know what it means to be both invisible and in the spotlight? At what point would the staring start to make him feel unsteady? How can I take him with me through every grocery store because half of the items tower above my head? Every obstacle course sidewalk, each maze between me and the ramp at the back of the building next to the garbage dumpster. Every bar and bank and cafe with counters so high they erase me from the room. Every restaurant and airplane where the toilet is entirely inaccessible to me. Would these field trips illuminate why I tried to believe I didn't belong, wasn't welcome, didn't have an invitation to be there? Would it solve the puzzle of a smart, competent girl becoming convinced that she'd never be able to join a workforce that exists on this planet? What hour could he live with me that would give him a glimpse of the power health insurance has over my life? I asked these questions not just for David or because I want to understand myself, but because I know I'm not the only one who's been regulated to the outside, assigned to the seats designated for others. So many of us grew up and continue to exist under crushing systems: racism, sexism, ageism, classism, homophobia, size discrimination. These structures are like factories pumping out blueprints, designs, infrastructures, tools, and stories that shape our world. They've been running for so long, shaping our cultural history and current landscape, and that a lot of us don't even notice the billows of smoke jetting out of their industrial sized stacks. They are fueled by the worth and power stolen from whole communities. They distort one sense of self, keep us quiet, and make us feel both small and like we're an enormous problem, both invisible and put on display, both a spectacle and swept under the rug. This act of thievery can be loud and violent or quiet and sneaky. There are ways these oppressive systems overlap, feed off each other, mirror one another, and there are also ways they remain uniquely distinct. As a white, cisgendered, straight woman who grew up in a middle class family, I won't pretend to understand most of these structures intimately. Even in my disabled body, I carry a world of privilege from where I sit and what I can see, though shame seems to be a best selling product pumped out of all of these crushing systems. So, how do we open the eyes of someone already on the inside to what's happening on the outside? Can we trace the ripples well enough to name the larger patterns? As much as numbers put me to sleep, sometimes they capture the scope of the problem in a way a string of observations can't. So here's some data of the United States gathered by Cornell University in 2017. At the time of the study, a person was well over twice as likely to live below the poverty line if they had a disability. The average annual income for a disabled person was $25,400 less than for a non disabled person. About 80% of non disabled people were employed, compared with 36% of disabled people. We could put many different insights out of these numbers, but one thing is clear: there's a gaping, fundamental disparity between the choices granted to disabled and non disabled folks. Then again, numbers catch only so much. Ableism can be hard to hold on to or pinpoint because it morphs. It lives in distinctly personal stories. It takes on 10,000 shifting faces, and for the world we live in today, it's usually more subtle than overt cruelty. Some examples to start the sketch: the assumption that all people who are deaf would prefer to be hearing, the belief that walking down the aisle at a wedding is obviously preferable to moving down that aisle in a wheelchair, the conviction that listening to an audiobook is automatically inferior to the experience of reading a book with your eyes, the expectation that a non disabled person would choose a partner with a disability is necessarily brave, strong, and especially good. The belief that someone who receives a disability check contributes less to our society than the full time worker. The movie that features a disabled person whose greatest battle is their own body and ultimately teaches the non disabled protagonist and audience how to value their own beautiful life. All of these are different flashes of the same oppressive structure. Ableism separates, isolates, assumes. It's starved for imagination, creativity, and curiosity. It's fueled by fear. It oppresses all of us. When I was small, just learning how to do life in my body, I didn't hesitate, didn't hold back, didn't worry how it would look, didn't look for cues or ask for a line. My imagination ruled. I saw no incongruities in being both a puppy rolling around in the mud and a poised princess. I wore dress up gowns on afternoon trips to the library and drew magic markered purple diamonds across my forehead and shins. I didn't wonder what dancing could or should be. I moved my body to the music and called it dancing. I used the shelves and the cabinets in the kitchen to climb onto the counter and crawled headfast towards the hardwood stairs at top speed. I scooted around the neighborhood on a red tricycle with streamers flowing out the handlebars. I was entirely free to be, driven by the innovation my body inspired. This is the wild emancipation I wish for all of you, a world where we are all free to be, to move, to exist in our bodies without shame. A world that isn't interested in making all of its humans operate in the exact same way. A world that instead strives to invite more, include more, imagine more. That world sees the humans existing on the margins and says, you have what we want. What barriers can we remove so we can have you around? What do you need? How can we make that happen? When you grow up in a world that doesn't see you or welcome you or include you or represent you, you believe the world isn't for you. I finally told David, it's for all the other people. The ones being seen, welcomed, included, represented. This is why I want to unbury the stories, to bring them into the light, to let them breathe in the open air, because our stories matter. Not only are we a part of this, but we're a vital missing piece. Thank you for asking, David, and anyone who's reading this book. Even more, thank you for doing your best to listen, even when words feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Here's to building new narrative pathways through our brains, our spaces, our stories. Here's to dismantling ableism, building a bonfire from its pieces, toasting marshmallows over the flame. Thanks for listening today.